Now we're getting to the second type of conjunction, which is the subordinating conjunction. I know for some folks it seems like a fancy grammatical term. It's really not. And these are still conjunctions in somewhat of the way that and, but, and or are, but they're a different type. They just work in a slightly different way. They do put two things together, but the very important thing they do is they create a dependent clause. They can take a perfectly good independent clause in which when you put one in front, put one of these subordinating conjunctions, they turn that independent clause into a dependent clause. That one word, that one subordinating conjunction, and these aren't really unusual words, they're not exotic or anything, they turn that independent clause into a very different type of clause, which is a dependent clause. And then what you can do with that dependent clause is you can connect it to the front or to the back of an independent clause. And this is very important. And the nature of the conjunctions are that they bring two things together. They stick two things together. With subordinating conjunctions, what they do is take that clause and allow you to connect it to the front of the independent clause or to the back of it. What you cannot do is say a dependent clause is a sentence. They must be attached to an independent clause. So what they do first is they turn an independent clause into a dependent, and then that dependent clause must be attached to an independent clause. That's what needs to be done. Okay? And it's one simple word. In some cases it's two, as if in a few others can operate as a subordinating conjunction. But they're not exotic words, they're not unusual. They're words like when, since, after, if, before, whenever, until, while, as, and although. These aren't unusual words. These are the types of words we use all the time and use every day. But these are conjunctions. If you're not familiar with subordinating conjunctions, you can look up a list or look at the list we have in the book, and then you're going to see that these aren't unusual. These are just the most common ones I've put up here. Again, words like when, since, after, if, before, whenever, until, while, as, although. And in each case, what these do, when you put them in front of an independent clause, they immediately transform that independent clause into a dependent clause with this one word at the front. The whole nature of the clause changes dramatically. It now must be attached to an independent clause. It can be placed at the front or at the back. So these become a very useful type of conjunction. They don't work like coordinating conjunctions. You don't create parallels with them. Instead, they only really operate with clauses. And again, if you have choppy sentences, what you can do is in fact put a subordinating conjunction in the front of one of them. It turns it into a dependent clause, and then attach that short sentence onto another short sentence, and now you have one longer sentence. And here's an example of what you might do. These are three clauses. Notice I haven't punctuated them and I haven't used any capital letters. The desert tortoise became endangered. Okay, that's an independent clause using a linking verb. Linking verb became. Okay? So the desert tortoise became endangered. That could be an independent clause, or it's an independent clause and it could be a sentence. I could decide this is a sentence. I could. That is a stylistic choice. The desert tortoise became endangered. But I could look at it and I could think, you know what? That doesn't really work well. And notice this is a stylistic choice. That doesn't work well for me. I really want to combine that with the one after it. What I could do is put a subordinating conjunction in front of this one. Many of them died from disease. That could be an independent clause. Notice I could have done this. Capital M and end it with a period. I could have had two very short sentences. The desert tortoise became endangered. Many of them died from disease. Two short independent clauses. But stylistically I could decide I don't like that. That is choppy. Choppy is not a grammatical error. It's a stylistic shortcoming. It's not a grammatical error, it's a stylistic shortcoming. It just has a poor effect on the reader who might think you're not as effective of a writer. What I could do with this one is put a subordinating conjunction in front of the second dependent clause, and I could now write the desert tortoise became endangered and combine it with the second one and have it read, the desert tortoise became endangered when many of them died from disease. That is now two clauses put together. This is the independent clause with the dependent clause attached to the end. What holds them together is the word when. The word when is a conjunction. It is a conjunction. In this case, it's in the middle of two clauses. You have an independent clause here, and this is a dependent clause here. This is being attached to the independent clause with the word when. That's something like the glue that's stuck in between, holding them together. So in this one, it seems to operate somewhat like a coordinating conjunction, just has a slightly different meaning. But watch what I can do. I have the first sentence somewhat rewritten at the end. They became endangered. I'm renaming the desert tortoise. I could rewrite that sentence this way. When many desert tortoises died from disease, and then I can turn this period into a comma, they became endangered. Now what I've done is turn this into the start of the sentence and this into the end of the sentence. They became endangered is an independent clause. It could stand alone. But I've decided, no, I don't want it to stand alone. I'm going to put a dependent clause at the front of it. But the dependent clause is at front and the independent clause is at the back. The when is holding them together from the front of the sentence. The when is a conjunction that could be placed in the middle, as it was in the first example, but it could also be working from the front of the sentence, holding this onto this. When many desert tortoises died from disease, they became endangered. That when is holding this dependent clause onto this independent clause from the front of the sentence. Notice you can choose whichever way you want. You can have it as two short sentences. That's a choppy effect. I prefer not to do it, but that's not a right and wrong. They're grammatically correct as two short sentences. Or you could have the dependent clause at the end or the dependent clause at the beginning and the independent clause at the end. It's up to you. There's no right and wrong with these. The only thing you have to watch out for is you don't punctuate a dependent clause as if it were a full sentence by itself. You would instead have what's called a fragment. It would have a subject and verb. If I did when many desert tortoises died from disease and put a period there, I would have a fragment. Why? Because I don't have an independent clause. If there's no independent clause, you can grammatically not have a sentence. Once you join it up to an independent clause, you now have a sentence. You're grammatically okay. That's your choice. But notice if you want many desert tortoises died from disease, you can do that as long as you get rid of the when. The when is what turns that perfectly good independent clause into a dependent clause, and then it needs to be attached onto an independent clause. Okay? So I hope that explains the logic of subordinating conjunctions. They are conjunctions. They just work differently from and, but, and or. And, but, or, and so. They work differently. They create dependent clauses. Once they're placed on the front of a clause, of an independent clause, they turn that independent clause to a dependent clause. Now that dependent clause can be joined to the sentence before it or to the sentence after it. It needs to be joined to one of them. It cannot stand by itself. That enables you to write longer sentences where you think it's necessary. And again, it's not an absolute necessity. You can write grammatically correct sentences without dependent clauses, without using subordinating conjunctions to create the dependent clauses. You can write grammatically correct, but almost all sophisticated writers use these frequently in their writing. What I've found is that most students, when they're writing the rough drafts, don't use many subordinating conjunctions, and they don't have many dependent clauses. In their later draft stages, once they've developed their ideas, they usually add on dependent clauses or turn independent clauses into dependent clauses and then add them onto other sentences, onto other independent clauses. So there's something to use in your second and third draft stages of writing wherever you sense that, hey, these sentences are a little bit choppy, this is something I could use. This is something I could use to actually create better flowing sentences. But that's an aesthetic choice. It's a style choice. Once you understand the structure of the language, and you see that these all have subjects and verbs, they're all clauses, then you can decide how to use these dependent clauses, how you want them to join on to other sentences. So if you're one of the students who's been told that you write in choppy sentences, try to reach for some of these. Or if you're, maybe you don't have a problem with choppy sentences, you can still add these on to develop your ideas and give them more specificity. Okay? So I hope that clarifies it. Take care.